Yesterday, the Chancellor set out plans to save jobs. Today, thousands are on the brink as businesses announce big cuts and closures, including Boots, General Electric, John Lewis and Burger King.
How are you?
Well, okay, mate, you?
Very nice to see you.
Yeah.
But as business confidence faltered, the Chancellor's remained as he responded to criticism of his job retention bonus, designed to protect furloughed staff by paying firms who keep them on until early next year.
9 million people who are currently furloughed will be eligible for the jobs retention bonus. So I think it will make a significant difference to the number of those people who can be brought back to those jobs. But I can't promise that every single one of those people will be. It's very hard to predict exactly where we'll end up. We're living at a time of incredible economic uncertainty, but I do believe that this bonus will make a difference to protecting as many of those 9 million jobs as possible.
But the head of the tax office was not so confident. As revealed in letters published by the government today, sent to Mr Sunak by HMRC ahead of yesterday's summer giveaway, in which its chief executive, Jim Hara, says the number of extra jobs the new scheme would protect is highly uncertain and that he couldn't be sure it would provide value for money or efficiency.
It's relatively unusual for the civil service to write these sorts of letters warning ministers against value for money, but it's more usual in a crisis because during a crisis, governments, I think quite rightly, sometimes take a punt on whether a scheme will work.
But according to Labour, that risk that the scheme will see cash handed over to firms who had no intention of laying off workers could have been avoided.
Our concern is that the action they've taken isn't focused on the right places. So the jobs retention bonus is a bonus for all jobs. And many of those jobs, many of the people would have been brought back in any event. Some are really at risk of losing their job. So we say it should have been targeted in the areas that most need it.
From the government this afternoon, more lockdown easing announcements designed to restart the UK's stalled economy.
We are confident enough that as we continue on this trajectory, that by the 25th of July, we'll be in a situation where we can reopen gyms and other facilities in that way.
Gyms in Northern Ireland, however, will reopen tomorrow, whilst in Scotland it will be the 15th of July for hairdressers and the 22nd for beauticians and nail salons.
Now, having allowed hairdressers to reopen, Beauticians, tattooists, spas, tanning salons and other close contact services can now do the same, I'm pleased to say, from Monday.
Normally we would have 3 chairs, we'd have the third chair.
So one here and...
One here, yeah.
Makeup artist and business owner Nikki was expecting to reopen on the 4th of July and is still waiting, even after today's announcement, as it doesn't include makeup application.
Yeah, we were really shocked to not be in amongst those other businesses, and it's just weird how we've just not been, it's almost like we've been left behind.
Are you worried about job losses in the beauty industry?
Of course, absolutely. The kind of people that work in this industry are fighters and are, we will do absolutely everything we can to continue and keep our businesses growing, thriving. Yeah, we're ready to come back to work. Yeah, we can't wait.
So even as lockdown lifts, there are still some firms left in the dark. And the Chancellor faces an even bigger challenge: how to prevent a public health crisis turning into a devastating economic one.
Well, in a moment, I'll be joined by the Conservative Chair of Parliament's Treasury Select Committee, Mel Stride. But a short while ago, I spoke to Jagjit Chadha, Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. And I started by asking if, given all today's job loss announcements, is yesterday's summer statement already starting to look a bit thin?
It was thin when it was announced. What was good, originally in the budget in March, was an impressive level of support to firms and the labour market through the coronavirus job retention scheme. But the announcements yesterday to end the scheme, we think, prematurely, but also not provide firms with a lot of support connected to the underlying problem in the economy. That is the virus, the lockdown, and the ultimate contraction activity. Means that firms are going to be losing confidence as to the level of demand for their goods and services later this year. And they have no option under those circumstances than to lay jobs off, lay people off, which is exactly what we're seeing today, and we will probably see as the year proceeds.
But if the government doesn't have a strategy to eradicate coronavirus, aren't you just delaying by extending the furlough scheme? I mean, you're just delaying the inevitable.
What we need is a statement that says that the support will be in place for as long as the economy is in a severe contraction. So rather than saying it's going to happen till October or end in November or end in December, we're going to say, look, for as long as this contraction is in place, as long as we're in lockdowns, as long as the economy hasn't recovered, we're going to offer some support for employers to hold on to their staff. We do want that extent of support to remain in place so that there's not a rapid increase in the unemployment rate.
But what about all the other measures that they've announced? I mean, billions of green investments, the VAT cut for hospitality. Doesn't that help encourage spending?
Yes, we want to see investment, but we need to see a consistent plan of investment over many years through chancellors and across lots of plans. We don't need a short-run announcement that we don't quite know whether it will be reversed or not, or still in place in a year's time. What industry needs, what firms need, is some sense in which these investments and these strategies will be carried out year after year, parliament after parliament. A VAT cut in a world in which people not going to be sure they're going to have a job in 6 months' time, in a world in which they're not quite sure whether their firm is going to still be in place in 6 months' time, isn't necessarily going to bring about very much of an increase in activity.
We're already today, though, starting to see the beginning of that narrative that we've seen before after crises, that, the public finances will have to be put back in order, we'll have to pay this back in some way, as if that's a real notion. I mean, does this need to be squashed right now before it takes hold?
You don't need to start today a discussion about increasing taxes. It's almost possible for the government to borrow at zero interest rates at the moment. They can meet these expenditures this year fairly easily. In fact, household saving has risen almost exactly to the extent to which the state wants to borrow. So there's no need even to borrow from overseas.
So where do you think unemployment's going to go? Would you bet on 3 million?
I wouldn't be surprised in this case if unemployment did get to 10%, the kind of numbers we haven't seen since 1992. That seems very likely given the contraction in activity that we've seen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krishna.
Well, the Conservative MP Mel Stride, chair of the Commons Treasury Committee, joins us now from central London. I mean, do you see today that there are just huge numbers of people who aren't saved by yesterday's plan for jobs?
Well, I think where the Chancellor is in terms of furlough, which is the major programme that is holding people not working, incidentally, but able to go back to work, the idea that it will end at the end of October, I think instinctively is broadly about right. This is a hugely expensive exercise, and in fact, it will have been in place for about 8 months by the time it concludes, and that's about a third of the entire workforce being paid substantially by the state. Now, that's something that, whether or not you've got access to funding at 0% or not, or thereabouts, that is still a huge amount of money. And I think the second thing... Are you
saying end it because of the amount of money?
No,
rather than the conditions that Jagjit Chadha was talking about.
There's a second point. There is an affordability point. You can't duck that. But I think there's a second point, which is that the economy now, as we come out of the trough of this recession, and that is what is happening, as we open the economy up, activity will start to expand. As we come through that part of the crisis, you're going to have businesses that, with a bit of help, and the Chancellor has laid out some of that in his statement yesterday, will get through that and maintain employment. But you've got other businesses where really those employees ultimately will have to move into other parts of the economy that are going to do better under the so-called new normal, and they will need training support and repurposing and so on. And so it's a difficult balancing act. You can't, I think, hold the economy forever and a day in aspect with nothing changing. The environment out there is changing, and we're going to have to see a shift in what the workforce is doing. And of course, it's all about timing and getting the balance right. It's a very difficult judgment. And the only other thing I would say is this isn't a one-off announcement yesterday. I believe the Chancellor will come back to the Commons.
There'll have to be more, won't there? I mean, the thing is, isn't it? I mean, doesn't it rather remind you of we're all in it together? you know, that yesterday was kind of an exercise of political communication, and Rishi Sunak's got a nice smile and he looks good. You know, and he said, if you look back at his speech, you know, he talked about, you know, people are anxious about losing their job, about unemployment rising. We're not just going to accept this. And yet, within hours, there are thousands of job losses announced because the businesses aren't impressed.
Unfortunately, the economy, for reasons that were outside of this government and other governments' control, has contracted by 25% in just a couple of months, and you can't avoid the consequences of that. But I think what the government has already demonstrated, actually, through the furlough scheme and the self-employment support scheme and other schemes to support business, is that they will throw the kitchen sink at trying to protect those jobs.
But isn't reopening at odds with all of that? Because, I mean, reopening risks more coronavirus and further lockdowns and local lockdowns that will be disastrous for businesses and the economy. So the government's strategy on COVID is at odds with its strategy on the economy.
No, I don't see that at all, actually. I think what the government is trying to do is make sure that the so-called R rate is below 1, and therefore that we don't have an expansion in cases of the virus, whilst at the same time opening up in a responsible way. And provided they can keep the R number below 1 and keep opening up the economy, you will start to see continued economic pickup, albeit that there is going to be a spike in unemployment. And I think what the government and the Chancellor are now trying to do is to blunt the extent of that spike. So what we don't want is to go back to the kind of levels we had in the 1980s, and hence the various measures, £30 billion worth of measures, incidentally, that were announced yesterday.
Mel Stride, thank you very much for joining us.
Now, the government has announced a further expansion of the testing programme in England, focusing on people in jobs with high levels of public contact, such as taxi drivers, cleaners and shop staff. They'll be tested even if they're not showing any symptoms, in an effort to identify the large numbers of people who have the virus but are asymptomatic. Our health and social care editor, Victoria MacDonald, has the details. Victoria.
Yes, it's one of the many unknowns about COVID-19 is who is asymptomatic. Some of the guesses at this are, and it really is only a guess, that it could be as many as 50 to 70% of people are asymptomatic. And this particularly matters, of course, in high-risk occupations, as you've mentioned, taxi drivers, for instance. What they need to know is whether these people are spreading the virus and, of course, how many there are. And they've also asked local authorities in Bradford, Newham, Brent and Oldham to select a group of people who, for asymptomatic testing, who are deemed to be high risk. This is a pilot study being run by the Department of Health and Social Care, and it is very important to try and gain more knowledge about what is actually happening out there in the community.
And Victoria, we got the latest figures from NHS Test and Trace today. So what do they show?
Yes, this is in England, of course, and it says that 76% of people were reached and asked for their contact. So no real change in 5 years. 5 years in 5 weeks. Gosh, sometimes it feels like years. This is a system that has proved slow to get up and running. And I have been speaking again to directors of public health, and I'm beginning to feel like a stuck record, but they are still complaining that they are not getting the data that they need in real time. They need things like age, sex, names, where people work, how they travel to work. In fact, one person I spoke to said that they really want a meeting with those who are running the test and trace system to be able to sit down with them and explain why they are not getting that data. Now, the other thing that was announced that is expected to be announced in the next few days is that there may be opening care homes to visitors again, which would be marvellous for a lot of us. But again, you are going to want a good test and trace system for these highly vulnerable people in very high risk situations.